He didn't know the office he'd just broken into was recording every breath he took. My brother-in-law had been calling me a failure for 11 years. To my sister's family, I was the cautionary tale they brought up at Thanksgiving, the one who left a stable government job to chase something nobody understood. My mother used to say it with this particular sigh, the kind that wasn't quite disappointment and wasn't quite pity, but somehow managed to be both at once. My sister would change the subject. Her husband, Colin, would smile. That smile. I should have paid more attention to it earlier. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened in that house in Oakville last November. What matters is that I was 31 years old. I had been quietly working for the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada, FineTrack, for 4 years, and not a single person in my family knew. They thought I did IT consulting, contract work, the kind of thing you do when you couldn't cut it anywhere else. Colin thought so too, which is exactly why he walked into my home office that Tuesday afternoon like he owned the floor he was standing on. I grew up the younger of 2 daughters in a house in Burlington, Ontario, where being quiet was mistaken for being weak. My sister Renata was everything I was not, at least on paper. She married young, married well, had 2 kids by 30, drove a Volvo, and belonged to a neighborhood association. She hosted Christmas. She sent cards on time. She was the kind of woman who made other women feel slightly behind schedule just by existing. I loved her. I want to be clear about that, even after everything. Colin was 6 years older than Renata. He'd made a lot of money in commercial real estate during the years when that was almost impossible not to do, and he wore his success like a second skin. He had opinions about wine. He had opinions about my career. He had opinions about the neighborhood I chose to rent in, the car I drove, and the fact that I had not yet, at 31, managed to buy property anywhere in the Greater Toronto area. Renting is burning money, he told me at Easter, not for the first time. You understand that, right? I understood plenty of things he didn't know. I understood. The house I rented in Oakville was modest by the street standards. A detached 2-story on a quiet cul-de-sac with a finished basement and, more importantly, a secondary room off the main bedroom that I'd converted into what looked, to anyone who walked in, like a spare office, a desk, a monitor, a filing cabinet, a potted plant that I kept alive out of sheer stubbornness. What it actually was I can't detail completely. What I can tell you is that every square centimeter of that room was monitored, and anything that occurred inside it was automatically logged, time-stamped, and encrypted to a server that was not located in my house. I'm telling you this now because it matters. It matters a great deal. That November had been building towards something for months. My mother had been unwell, nothing critical, but enough that the family started doing that thing families do where they circle each other nervously and someone has to be blamed for the anxiety. Renata and Colin had been having money problems, which Colin was very good at hiding in the way that people who have always had money are good at hiding when they suddenly don't. There had been a deal that fell through. 2 deals. I'd heard things. Not through official channels, not yet, just through the static of a family that talks too much when it's stressed. Colin had started asking my mother questions. Gentle ones, about her will, about house in Burlington which my parents had paid off in 2003 and which, in the current market, was worth somewhere between $1.2 and $1.4 million. My father had been gone for 6 years. My mother was 72 and tired and trusted her son-in-law because he handled the finances. Because that was the role he'd been given, because nobody had ever thought to question whether the role suited him. I had started to question it. I'd asked my mother carefully over the phone in September whether Colin had ever had her sign anything she didn't fully understand. There was a pause that was too long to be nothing. He's very good with paperwork, she said. You know I'm not. I told her that was fine. I told her I loved her. I hung up and sat very still in my kitchen for a long time. The week before Thanksgiving, my mother mentioned that Colin had suggested she update her power of attorney, that he'd recommended a lawyer she'd never met, referred by Colin with an office in a building Colin managed. She thought it sounded convenient. I thought it sounded like something else entirely. I tried to talk to Renata. That was my mistake, or maybe Not a mistake. Maybe it was just a step that had to happen before everything else could happen. Renata listened to me over the phone with the silence of someone who has already chosen a side. Then she said, "You've always had a problem with Colin." Then she said, "Maybe instead of working your little contracts, you could focus on your own life." Then she said she had to get the kids from school. I sat with that for a few days. I thought about my mother signing papers she didn't understand in a lawyer's office she'd been steered toward by the man who stood to benefit. I thought about the way Colin smiled at Easter. I thought about what I actually did for a living and whether it was time to stop keeping those things separate. I filed an internal disclosure. Nothing dramatic, just a document that said I have a personal connection to individuals who may be relevant to a matter I am flagging for review. I named Colin. I named the company he'd been running the questionable transactions through. A numbered company in Ontario with a registered address I recognized as a postbox operation near the Burlington GO station. I asked to be kept at arm's length from any formal investigation. They kept me at arm's length. They did not tell me the investigation had already been underway for 8 months before I filed anything. I found that out later. What I didn't know in those first weeks of November was how much pressure Colin was under. I didn't know that someone had begun asking questions at his brokerage. I didn't know his margin calls were compounding. I didn't know he told Renata half the story and none of the important parts, or that Renata, who was loyal to the point of self-destruction, had decided that I was the problem. I was the one who was meddling. I was the one who had always been jealous. I was the one who had, in her version of things, spent my entire adult life trying to undermine a marriage I resented because I couldn't build one of my own. It is astonishing the stories people tell themselves. He showed up on a Tuesday. I was working from home, which I did 3 days a week, and I heard the car in the driveway and thought at first it was my neighbor. Then I heard the front door. I'd given Renata a key 2 years ago for emergencies, and I came to the top of the stairs and there was Colin in my hallway, and his face was the face of a man who had been frightened for months and had finally decided to turn it into anger. "We need to talk," he said. "You're in my house," I said. "Renata's house too, practically. She's been paying half your groceries for years. Don't think I don't know." That was not true. It was not remotely true. But I knew in that moment that we were not in the territory of truth anymore. I came downstairs. I told him to sit in the kitchen. He didn't sit in the kitchen. He walked to the hall, through the living room, and toward the back of the house, and I knew where he was going because it was the only room he'd shown interest in before. The office, the place where I worked, the place he assumed held secrets he could use. "Colin," I said, "you need to stop." "You filed something." He turned around. His face was very controlled in the way of someone performing control. "Someone at the board contacted my lawyer, and it has your fingerprints on it. You think I don't know how these things work? I think you should leave my house." "You're trying to destroy my family." "You should leave." He stepped toward me, and I want to be careful here about what I say, because what happened next is documented and in evidence and has been reviewed by people whose job it is to be precise about these things. He grabbed me by the wrist. He pushed me against the door frame. I hit my head. Not badly, but I have the medical record. And when I told him to let go, he grabbed my upper arm instead and pulled me down the hallway toward the office and said, through his teeth, that I was going to tell him exactly what I had filed and exactly who I had spoken to, and that if I had compromised his family, I was going to understand what that meant. He was bigger than me. He had been playing squash twice a week for 15 years, and he was 6'1", and I am 5'4", and I am telling you this not for sympathy, but because it is relevant to what I decided to do. I went with him. I let him pull me into the office. I let him push me into the chair at the desk and stand over me and say all the things he needed to say. About what I was, about what I'd cost him, about how my mother would find out the kind of daughter I really was, about how Renata had always protected me even when I didn't deserve it, about how I had taken a stable family and set fire to it because of my own bitterness. I let him talk for a long time. And then I said, very quietly, "Are you finished?" He laughed. The kind of laugh that is really just contempt with some air behind it. You have nothing, he said. You're a contract worker with a grudge. I want you to look at the plant, I said. He looked at the potted plant on the filing cabinet, the one I kept alive out of stubbornness, the one that had been in that spot since I moved in, which I had never once moved, which had a very small secondary purpose that had nothing to do with photosynthesis. You've been in this room for 12 minutes, I said. Everything you just said has been recorded. The moment you grabbed my wrist in the hallway, that triggered an automatic flag. There are 2 separate systems logging this. One of them I manage, one of them I don't. The color left his face in a way I had not seen before on a person. It was almost clinical to watch. You're lying, he said. Colin, I said, I've worked in financial intelligence for 4 years. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what I've had access to? The numbered company, the Burlington address, the transfers to the account in the name of your mother-in-law, who did not authorize those transfers, which I know because I sat across from her at her kitchen table and I asked her. He didn't move. The power of attorney referral. The lawyer you recommended. The meeting she hasn't taken yet because I asked her to wait. The pattern across 18 months that a forensic accountant, not me, someone else, someone whose name you don't have, has been building into a file. He sat down on the floor. I don't mean he found a chair. I mean his legs went out from under him and he sat down on my floor. I want my sister to be okay, I said. I want my mother to be okay. What happens to you is going to happen to you regardless of anything I do now, because this was already in motion before I filed anything. But what you just did in this room and in this hallway, that's new, and it's documented. He didn't say anything for a long time. Was any of the money for her? I asked. Was any of it for Renata, for the kids? A pause. It was supposed to be, he said. And for a moment he sounded like a person. It wasn't though, I said. He was arrested 4 weeks later. The charges were not from my agency. I was, as promised, kept at distance, but from the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit and the Ontario Securities Commission, acting on a file that had been building since February of that year. There were 23 counts. The numbered company. A second one in BC I hadn't known about, and a third arrangement involving a development project in Hamilton where the investors had been promised returns that were, to put it in the language of the eventual court documents, fraudulently misrepresented. My mother's money was not in it. She had not signed anything. The meeting with a referred lawyer never happened. Renata called me the night Colin was arrested. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Did you know this was coming?" "I knew something was," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that. I thought about the phone call where she'd said I'd always had a problem with Colin. I thought about what it would have meant to tell her, the choice she would have had to make before she was ready, the way she would have had to look at her own life and see the parts that weren't what she'd believed them to be. "You weren't ready," I said. She cried for a while and I stayed on the phone. That's what sisters do. The recording from my office was submitted as part of the broader evidentiary file, not as the central evidence, because the financial case didn't need it, but as supporting documentation for the assault charge, which Colin's lawyer attempted to have withdrawn twice and failed both times. The bruising on my arm was photographed the same afternoon. I had gone straight from the house to a walk-in clinic on Spears Road, told the nurse exactly what had occurred, and had it documented. She asked me gently whether I was safe. I told her I was. I told her it was already being handled. The assault charge resulted in a conditional sentence. That was less than I wanted and more than his lawyer expected, and I decided to accept it as the complicated thing it was. Colin's eldest child is 9. His youngest is 6. They are my nieces and they will grow up knowing their father made serious mistakes and that their family survived it, and that their aunt, the one they used to hear adults dismiss at dinner, had been doing work none of them understood in a room none of them knew anything about. My mother sat with me on her porch in Burlington last spring, the first warm week of May, and she said, "I used to worry about you." She said it with a different tone than I was used to, not the sigh, something else. "I know," I said. I didn't understand what you did, she said. I thought it wasn't real. It's real, I said. She patted my hand. We drank tea and watched the neighbor's dog patrol the fence line, and I didn't explain any more than I already had. And she didn't ask. I'm still renting. I'm still in Oakville. The plant is still on the filing cabinet. I kept it there on purpose. I still think about the moment Colin sat down on my floor. Not the charges, not the courtroom, not the newspaper headline his lawyer tried to suppress, just that moment. The way his legs went out from under him. The way 11 years of contempt left his face all at once, and what was left underneath looked very small. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. I understand why they ask. He has 2 daughters. Renata had to sell the Volvo and move into a smaller place in Stony Creek and start over at 38. There are real costs to the truth coming out, and they don't fall evenly, and that's not a comfortable thing to sit with. But I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet. My mother signing papers in a lawyer's office she'd been steered toward. Her house, the one my father worked 30 years to pay off, quietly folded into a structure designed to benefit a man who'd been smiling at our family dinners while he built it. The silence would have had costs too. They just would have landed on someone who couldn't absorb them. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, in the way that settles into your bones rather than just your head, is that doing the right thing rarely announces itself as the right thing in the moment. When I filed that internal disclosure, I wasn't certain. I was scared and I second-guessed myself for 2 weeks straight. What I had was not confidence. It was just a clear enough understanding of what was happening that I couldn't pretend otherwise. That clarity was the only thing I trusted. I think about the kind of person I had to be to get through that year. Not brave in the dramatic sense. Just honest. Honest about what I saw. Honest about what my job required of me. Honest with my mother when I asked her that careful question in September and then had to sit with her long pause. Integrity isn't a feeling. It doesn't feel like anything in particular. It mostly feels like discomfort you decided not to run from. And the intelligence piece. I don't mean my job, I mean the habit of actually thinking before acting. Colin acted on fear and assumption. He assumed I was a contract worker with a grudge. He assumed the room was just a room. He assumed that showing up and applying pressure would work because it had worked before, in other rooms with other people who hadn't been paying close enough attention. I had been paying attention for months. That attention was the only real advantage I had. What carried me through the parts that were just hard? The call with Renata, the walk-in clinic, sitting with my mother on her porch trying to explain something I could only explain partway, were the kind of stubbornness I used to be embarrassed about. I kept the plant alive out of stubbornness. I kept going out of the same thing. I don't think resilience is something you develop by trying to develop it. I think it's what's left when you've already decided that stopping isn't an option. Colin made his choices across years. Small ones at first, probably. Rationalizations that compounded. That's how most disasters are built, not in one dramatic moment, but in a long series of quiet ones, where the easier thing kept winning. I made mine too. And they compounded in a different direction. The plant is still in the filing cabinet. I keep it there to remember that some things stay exactly where you put them, and that's not nothing.